Now they will know why they are afraid of the dark. Now they will learn why they fear the night.
Welcome, cinephiles, to another episode of the Cinephobia podcast, part of the YouTube channel Cinephobia, your home for all things cinema and scary. I'm your host with the most, JP. Our guest today on the cast is Stephen J. Rubin, producer, screenwriter, and author of the Twilight Zone Encyclopedia and the James Bond Encyclopedia, both available to purchase wherever books are sold. Thanks for being on the show today, Steve.
Thank you, Jeremy. It's so good to be here.
As much as I love James Bond, we're sidestepping 007 for the fifth dimension, as today we're talking about one of my favorite TV shows and one of the few series to stand the test of time. Widely regarded as one of the best TV series of all time, Rod Serling's The Twilight Zone debuted on CBS in 1959, ran for 5 seasons before ultimately getting canceled in 1964. Revivals of the show in 1985, 2002, and most recently 2019 failed to capture the magic and viewing audience of the original classic, not to mention a feature film version of the show which was most remembered for the on-set tragedy that marred production. In addition to these iterations, the beloved show has also took the form of a radio series, TV movie, theme park attractions, as well as various iterations of novels, short stories, and comic books. Its influence on pop culture and storytellers and filmmakers of today is immeasurable, as it paved the way for every anthology show to precede it, such as The Outer Limits, Tales from the Crypt, and most recently Black Mirror. For the purposes of today's episode, though, we'll mainly be focusing on the original 5-season run of the series, which produced 156 episodes, most of them written by the creator, Rod Serling. I'm really excited to have you on the show today, Steve. This gave me the perfect opportunity to go back and watch some of these episodes, which it's been so long since I've seen. And speaking of Rod Serling and his immense contribution to the show and how many episodes that he wrote, one of the things that I wanted to ask is, some of the episodes are teleplays by Serling based on short stories. Do you happen to know where and how he chose these stories?
Well, that's a very good question. When Rod opened his doors and told the community he was doing an anthology series, I think every writer of note in America started sending him ideas. I frankly, I don't know how they read so much material, because from what I gathered from my research, the offices at MGM where he had his offices were stacked to the gills with books and magazine articles, short stories, original scripts. He just put out the word and he got it from everywhere. He was not a neophyte when it came to science fiction, fantasy, and horror short stories. I think he knew many of the authors. He read a great deal. He may have been the most well-read teleplay writer of his day, particularly in genre. So they came from many different sources. And of course, being a legitimate show that was going to go on the air in the fall of 59, everybody knew about it and everybody was submitting.
So many of these short story writers, they were aware that Rod was looking for stories in order to use in the show, and they were all chomping at the bits in order to be a part of it.
Very true. Now, originally, Rod wanted to get Ray Bradbury heavily involved in the show. And CBS absolutely refused to pay for Ray Bradbury's salary as a contributing, producer writer. So in the whole run of the series for 5 years, there was only one episode that was written by Ray, which was about I always forget the name of the episode, but it was an episode in which a family is looking for a new nanny and they end up hiring a robot nanny.
Oh, I think I remember that one. Yeah.
Yeah. The 3 guys he relied on the most, which put together one of the great teams in television history, Richard Matheson, George Clayton Johnson, and Charles Beaumont. Those 3 guys contributed a good bulk of the shows that Rod didn't write. And you yourself said that he wrote the bulk of them. He wrote 92 of 156, which is considering the level of quality, is unbelievable.
It's amazing.
I don't think it's ever been duplicated in the history of any shows. I mean, there have been writers who've written a lot of episodes, but Rod wasn't writing a regular narrative series. He was writing an anthology series. So basically, he had to reinvent the wheel every time he opened his typewriter. So rather than write a continuing episode of The Defenders or Untouchables, he had to just start over every week. And 92 originals is pretty amazing.
Oh, it's incredible. And to the detriment of his health at some point, because he was exhausted. At one point, he mentioned that he was writing so much stories that he didn't know what was good and bad anymore. Is that correct?
Well, he had gone through the same issue when he was writing for live television. Most of your people who are listening aren't aware of a lot of Rod's background. I mean, Rod Serling was a traumatized World War II paratrooper who saw horrible things in the Philippines where he was stationed and fought. And he was probably an early PTSD sufferer. They didn't call it then that. They called it shell shock or trauma. So when he came back through Chicago, headed back east, he was told to try to channel his psychological things into something that could be more productive so he wouldn't be thinking about the war so much. And he turned to writing. And he went back to college. He started writing for radio. And then when radio, he moved on from radio to do live television. And this is the beginning of the 1950s when live television was king. And he was so prolific. He wrote literally scores of shows. And he later admitted that most of them were pretty awful. But he did win, I believe, 4 Emmys during that period. I think three for his live TV work, and I think 3 for the Twilight Zone.
Now, do you know if prior to getting out of the military, did he write at all before that? Or did his writing career really start after he left the military and he was looking for an outlet for these emotions and feelings?
I believe it really started after the war. I think, like a lot of veterans, he came back from World War II with an entirely new perspective on what was important in life. I mean, he suffered great trauma. Friends of his were blown to bits. One of his best friends was standing out on in a field, and they were witnessing a parachute drop of supplies for their beleaguered unit. And one of the crates landed on his friend and killed him instantly.
Oh my God.
Just awful, awful.
So he started writing then, and obviously he was very prolific. Do you have any idea why he was so prolific and why he was able to write so much quality material over the short span of his life?
Good question. He loved writing. I think Rod Serling was a very unique writer in the sense that he in his own creative way captured the voice of the common man. I think that part of the success of the Twilight Zone series is that these were everyday people for the most part that everybody could identify with. They were people caught up in what I call the what if situations. And he, for my money, even though Rod Serling did not pioneer the what if genre, which probably goes all the way back to Jules Verne, H.G. Wells, Robert Louis Stevenson, he turned it into a really practical genre for television. And essentially every Twilight Zone episode starts with what if. What if there was a gunfight and one of the guys had a special potion that made him faster than the other? What if I was in a tank on the prairie in South Dakota, and all of a sudden I hear the war whoops of the Indians be attacking Custer? I mean, these are great, interesting little setups. And almost virtually every Twilight Zone episode has that setup about what if. And I think he let his imagination go. And he's inspired writers ever since. He certainly inspired me. I never put a lid on my imagination. Rod would never allow that.
And you can just imagine what today's pop culture and storytelling landscape would be without his influence and contribution. I mean, thinking about this recently, M. Night Shyamalan, obviously greatly influenced by Rod Serling and the Twilight Zone. We wouldn't have The Sixth Sense. We wouldn't have the enormity of great storytelling films and TV shows that we have if it wasn't for his influence on storytellers of today.
Very true. The one thing, though, that probably was not something that reached, well, how do I put this? Rod had a very specific style, which was very dialogue heavy. He told his stories through words. He did not necessarily tell his stories through pictures. So he was not a poetic person in terms of his visualization. I think Hollywood by the early 1960s was starting to get away from heavily dialogued stories. And there was more of a sense that color was coming in. Let's make the picture beautiful. We don't have to worry as much about how people are talking, which of course is ridiculous. But what are the shows that replaced the Twilight Zone in '64? I mean, you have shows on the air like the Beverly Hillbillies, the Gilligan's Island, 19 different cop series. The dialogue didn't mean as much. Yet there were practitioners of it like Rod, Reginald Rose, Patty Chayefsky. These are writers that you bounce quarters off their dialogue. I mean, it's so beautifully written. I worked very closely in my James Bond encyclopedia with Richard Maybaum, who was a contemporary of Serling's. And his dialogue is marvelous in the early James Bond movies, very quotable. I would argue that since then, there have been very few quotable James Bond lines, just as there's very few quotable lines in Hollywood as a rule. I mean, we don't remember dialogue anymore. We don't remember episode names. And yet you and I can talk about 156 Twilight Zone episodes, not only quote dialogue, but we can actually remember the name of the episode for the most part.
Well, it just goes to show how influential the show has been and how it stood the test of time. Why do you think it still holds up today after 50 plus years and audiences are still discovering it and still enjoying it to today?
Well, first of all, and this kind of, for me personally, is the reason the revivals haven't worked. I will say that Black Mirror is, kind of from a different ilk, but making a Twilight Zone episode in color immediately cuts about half of your atmosphere out of it. You're kind of in a familiar world. I think Rod's episodes of the original Twilight Zone, you're immediately in a different world because it's black and white. So you're already a little bit off your traditional viewing. The other thing I noticed, and this may be minor, but it is something that I made notice of, product placement is very prevalent in TV and film today. I mean, guy drives into a gas station, often it's a Chevron station or a Mobil station or a Shell station. They drive by a McDonald's. All the accoutrement of American modern advertising is available. I watched all 156 episodes with a legal pad, just writing down notes for every episode that I noticed. There was virtually no product placement in the entire series. There are two things technically that could be considered product placement. At one point, somebody shows a Mickey Mouse watch. And then in the very first episode, which was not filmed at MGM, it was shot at Universal. It's called Where Is Everybody? With Earl Holliman running around in that empty town. He walks by a gas station and there's a sign for an oil company that was a real oil company, I discovered. In 156 episodes, that's the only time you had product placement. So between the black and white, nothing familiar from our world, I think really contributed terrifically to the atmosphere. He wasn't being distracted in telling his stories.
I think that's a really great observation that you made right there that really stood out to me is why the series works so well. Like you said, it immediately distanced you from it. It makes the audience feel off kilter. When it's in color, it's more familiar. So you think that might have been another reason why the other iterations weren't as successful. We all know that Rod Serling also had another anthology show later on, which was The Night Gallery. I'm not too familiar with that one. However, I was curious, how do you think it stacks up to The Twilight Zone? And do you feel that the use of color in that show hindered it from becoming as successful as The Zone?
Well, first of all, to start off with, it was not a Rod Serling show. It was a Jack Laird show. Rod was hired as the host, and Rod wrote episodes.
Okay.
It was not by any means Rod's show. The quality control was not there. For some odd reason, the length of the episodes were different lengths. In an hour on Night Gallery, you might get a 20-minute episode, you might get a 5-minute episode, you might get a 15-minute episode. I mean, it was all over the place. The quality went up and down. There were some good episodes. Like the Twilight Zone had a great opening. I mean, Rod walking past those weird paintings, and it just got you right in the mood. But not a good quality show. And I'm sure the color didn't help things, but it wasn't just the color, it was the quality.
And it was also the runtime, because as we all know, season 4 of The Twilight Zone switched to an hour-long format and is widely considered probably the worst season of the television show. And it seemed like the half-hour format was just the perfect amount of runtime in order to get the story and not stay too long in it. Would you agree?
I don't agree. I think that in watching the episodes very carefully, I was very keen on paying attention to the 4th season to see if it was as bad as we'd all figured it. You know, the general feeling was they were padded shows. They didn't have the tightness of the half hours, but there are some really good 1-hour episodes. There were only 18, and I would say half of them are very good. The one that people point out to as being the best is always the James Whitmore episode, where the stranded space colonists who have been supported all these years by James Whitmore's character, what happens when they're rescued and what happens to James Whitmore's character. It's an episode called On Thursday We Leave for Home, and it's a terrific episode. But there are other ones too that I hadn't seen. You know, I over the years, they don't show a lot of the 1 hours. I particularly like Valley of the Shadow with Ed Nelson. That's a pretty cool setup too. He's a journalist traveling to Albuquerque, and he stops off in this little town with this big sheepdog. And all of a sudden the sheepdog chases a cat, and a little girl comes out of a house with some kind of device and points it at the dog, and the dog disappears. And Ed Nelson's character is watching this saying, what the? That's how it starts. It's a great little moment. And I like that episode a lot. The Burgess Meredith episode is also very good. The 1 hour, I think it's called Printer's Devil. And there's also a Jack Klugman episode, which is very eerie and cool. So there are some high points there. So I again, it's been common rule to disparage the hours, but there are some really good ones.
So for fans of the Zone who might have been sidestepping the 4th season based on what they heard or the runtime, you would suggest that it's worth looking into and discovering, even though it might not match up to the level of quality that some people consider of the other seasons.
Absolutely. I advise those of you who do not have the complete set of the Twilight Zones, you can get them. They're available online. They're just a joy. And the Blu-rays are even more of a joy because the quality, particularly for the filmed episodes. Unfortunately, in the 2nd season, James Aubrey, the head of CBS, who did not like Serling, who did not like Anthology, and thus did not like the Twilight Zone, was always trying to figure out an excuse to get rid of it, because he's the one who canceled Playhouse 90, at that point, one of the most honored television series in history. So he decided he was going to cut their budget. So I think in the 2nd season, there are 6 videotaped episodes.
Yeah, I remember some of the episodes looking a little off, like they were filmed using a different camera or different technology.
They were filmed on videotape, and they look awful.
Yeah. There's no other way around it.
It's too bad, because they're good episodes. I mean, Night of the Meek with Art Carney as this drunken Santa Claus is a classic episode, but I think it just doesn't look as good.
Yeah, totally. Now, when it comes to writers of the show, obviously we know that Rod Serling wrote a majority of them, but he did have a team of writers, like you mentioned, Richard Matheson, who helped contribute to the show. Who is your favorite writer on the show besides Rod?
Well, Matheson always brought something kind of special to his writing. Matheson was very good at starting out with a very normal setting and then twisting it on its head. I think I love the episode where William Shatner's on the plane. It's a plane flight. He's looking out the window, Nightmare at 20,000 feet. That's a Matheson episode, which was remade in the movie. And I thought that was terrific. He also did so I'm trying to remember the name of the one where also a Shatner episode where they go into the diner, he and his wife, and they
Nick of Time.
Nick of Time. They take the little
fortune-telling
machine that with that little devil's head on it, which was so eerie. And now
creepy.
You can buy that. You can buy that and put it in your living room.
I've seen that for sale. I'm really tempted to get one.
Yeah, of course. But be careful what you wish for.
Oh, yeah.
And Matheson talks a little about, in his interviews, talks a little bit about where he got his ideas. I mean, he was on a plane flying somewhere and he was looking out at a cloud formation. And I guess in his own imagination, he pictured himself skiing down that cloud. And then that led to thinking about what could be hiding in that cloud. And of course, he ended up with the gremlin on the wing. I love Matheson, but Beaumont also brought a very interesting, almost macabre approach to his stories. And he often talks about being raised by his 6 aunts or something like 6 aunts and very odd ladies. And of course, he died very young. I think Beaumont died in his early 40s. So he was very prolific until then. And he and Matheson were terrific contributors to the series. And then George Clayton Johnson also wrote some terrific episodes, including Kick the Can, which was also remade in the movie.
Right. Now, speaking of the Twilight Zone, the movie, personally, I'm a big fan of it. I watched it as a kid, nostalgia purposes. I really enjoyed it. Obviously, they used episodes that were in the original series and they kind of remade them, such as The Nightmare at 20,000 Feet. In your book, in the author's note, you mentioned that this book is devoted solely to the original black and white Twilight Zone, which for your money is the only Twilight Zone. But if you wouldn't mind indulging me just for a second to talk about the movie, how do you feel the movie stacks up, or why wasn't it as successful as the series, minus the tragedy that befell the actors on set?
Another very good question. First of all, the movie was put together by people who love the Twilight Zone.
Exactly.
So unlike a lot of remakes that are in film where for some reason the inspiration seems to have disappeared and they're just shooting film blindly, I think the Twilight Zone was an inspired idea by people who truly love the Twilight Zone. I mean, Dan Aykroyd and John Lithgow and all these wonderful performers obviously love what they were doing. And, directors like Joe Dante and John Landis were big Twilight Zone fans. I mean, they were all Twilight Zone fans. So I think it started out really well. I think the quality of the shows, though, was a little up and down. That hurt it. The tragedy of the John Landis episode is that it just, I don't even know how to describe my feeling about it. On the one hand, I was horrified by what happened, but the episode itself is pretty strong.
It is.
I can't help but wonder why they had to have children in that river at the end. Obviously, for those of you who don't know the tragedy, there was a helicopter hovering over the river. There were explosions. Vic Morrow's character has actually redeemed himself by helping these 2 children survive a battle. And then the helicopter fell on them and killed everybody. It was just horrifying.
Yeah.
I think it's a really good question. I don't really know why the film didn't succeed. It certainly got a big promotion from Warner Brothers. I remember Michael Strago, who was a prominent film critic with the San Francisco Chronicle. He actually came up with a little poem for the review of the film. He said that, Stevens uneven. I was referring to Steven Spielberg's episode.
Right.
Landis is blandest, so he thought it was very bland.
Yeah.
Dante is enchante, so he loved the Dante episode.
Okay.
And Miller's the thriller, so he loved the Miller episode. Obviously, the Nightmare at 30,000 feet. I think they had to change the altitude in the remake.
And my God, John Lithgow, the performance that he gave in that one, Becoming Unhinged, was just fantastic. You know, George Miller, creator of the Mad Max franchise, was the one that directed that segment, and they really did a fantastic job of bringing that to the big screen and modernizing it, really giving the original a run for its money.
Well, they also spent a ton of money. I mean,
that's true. They had a lot more money.
And you got to give Jerry Goldsmith credit for the music for that episode. It's just fabulous, as it is throughout the whole series, throughout the whole movie. In researching the original with William Shatner, they talk a little bit about the Nick Cravat character. Nick Cravat was a friend of Burt Lancaster's, who was always he was a former circus acrobat. So he got the job of playing the gremlin on the wing. And they went to costuming at the big MGM costume department, and they ended up giving him a giant bear costume. So it was probably, it originally had the head of a bear, but he had the body of a bear and that weird makeup. And he's bouncing along on the wing on that tank stage where they had that goofy thing with Shatner, which I told the people about. So it's interesting.
Part of, I think, why the Twilight Zone works so well is they were working with very limited resources, and they were still able to make it work and pull it off in such a way that obviously we're still watching it to this day. So it's a real testament to the ingenuity of the filmmakers and Rod Serling, how they were able to come up with such quality material on such a small budget.
Oh, yeah. And one of the things you got to give credit to is George Clemon's camera work. I mean, those shows just in regular television were just so beautifully shot. In Blu-ray, they just knock your socks off. That's why the 6 videotaped episode in Season 2 don't look very good at all today, because the filmed ones look tremendous. I mean, the sharpness is beyond crazy. They didn't have a lot of money. I think Buck Houghton, who was Rod's producer the first 3 seasons, made the very, very strategic decision to film the show at MGM, which had the biggest lot, or the biggest lots in America at that time, even bigger than Universal. So they were able to find almost anything they needed except for their desert locations. And of course, several episodes were shot out in the Mojave.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, I was watching one of the Blu-ray episodes the other day, and it was the first time that I actually seen any of the Blu-ray episodes of the Twilight Zone, and I was just floored at how crisp and clean the image was. It was really astounding. The episode that I watched that was on Blu-ray, I forget the name of it at the moment, but it was about a man in his apartment building, and he was a conspiracy theorist, and he was calling all these people up and making trouble for him. And the wife of one of the men who he was calling up was a doctor, and he was saying that he committed malpractice and all these sort of things. And while watching that episode again for the first time in a long time, it struck me at how much that story resonates even to today's audience with conspiracy theorists and obviously the rise of the internet and YouTube and all that, and how this character is a reflection of a lot of the kind of people that we have around today who kind of feed into these conspiracy theories. Do you remember that episode?
Yeah, I think Theodore Beikel made a career later on being Tevye in revivals of Fiddler on the Roof. He played the lead. I think, if I'm not mistaken, I want to say the episode's name was 12 O'Clock. I think.
Oh, 4 o'clock. 4 o'clock.
4 o'clock.
That's right, because he was saying at 4 o'clock, all the evil people are going to be turned small, and then by the end, obviously, we have a really cool twist.
Oh yeah, that was an interesting episode. Little stories that just really struck people as being so cool. The Twilight Zone was very popular in its day amongst college students. It was kind of water cooler talk, for people at work and young people. I don't know if it was really as popular for young people. I'm a perfect example. I wandered into the living room one night. My parents were watching an episode called The Silence, which you'll remember, the one where this motor mouth guy will not stop talking in this private club, and this older guy bets him $500,000 that he can't talk for a whole year. So I looked at that episode. I lasted about 3 minutes and I ran into the other room. There's no way I was watching it. I think I was 9 years old at that time. And the thought of not being able to speak for a year was too frightening to even consider.
So that was the first time that you were exposed to the series. And it wasn't until later on in life that you rediscovered it and grew to love it and had this passion for it. How old were you and what were the circumstances surrounding it when you later did rediscover it again?
That's a good question, too. You're just full of good questions today.
I did my research. I wanted to come with some questions that no one has asked you.
Like everybody else, I probably discovered them in reruns. I've always been a big time travel nut. I think the concept of time travel stories, which was also one of Rod's favorite devices, intrigued me. So the episodes that involve time travel, I think I embraced initially very much. The Odyssey of Flight 33, where the plane goes through a barrier, ends up in the dinosaur age, was cool. Certainly Walking Distance is a legendary episode from the first season. The seventh is made up of phantoms. And interestingly, that's the one involving Custer's Last Stand. I was able to do that as an experimental film return. I did it about late 90s. I actually took a group of people down to the Camp Pendleton Marine Base in Southern California, and we remade The Seventh is Made Out of Phantoms.
Get out of here.
We called it Timeout for Bravo 7. And instead of using an old M3 Stewart tank, which is what they had in the original, the U.S. Marine Corps supplied us with a light armored vehicle and a squad of soldiers. It was a squad of Marines.
Wow. Where can we find this to view at? I am interested.
Someday I have to put it up on YouTube because I did it as kind of an experiment. So even though we completely rewrote Rod's episode, I don't think I can really run it for any commercial use.
Well, I don't know about anybody else, but I'm really interested to see what this looks like and how it turned out. Steve, you mentioned that later on in life, you rediscovered the series. And as many people know, and I think they still do it, the Sci-Fi Channel has a biannual marathon. I think they do it twice a year. Once is on the 4th of July, and the other is on New Year's Eve. My question is, do you feel like these Sci-Fi Channel marathons have helped keep the show alive and helped introduce new audiences to the show who might not have otherwise discovered it?
Completely. I think it's an event. And people during holiday time usually get together. So you're usually in a group setting. So I think that's contributed magnificently to keeping the Twilight Zone alive. Absolutely.
And I can attest to that because most of the episodes that I remember seeing were on these Sci-Fi Channel marathons, watching them as a kid all day long. 4th of July specifically, I remember being at my grandmother's house and sitting there and watching 5 characters in search of an exit and just being blown away at the quality of this show and just sparking my young imagination. So I'm really happy that there's a channel out there and a place and a home where people can find this show and discover them for the first time, or if not, discover them again later on.
Exactly. And I think that young people today have a kind of an allergy to black and white. I think they consider black and white to be old business. But if you explain it to them a little bit and you show them a couple of episodes, they're hooked. And my son is a perfect example. I think when he was about 14, he watched some Twilight Zones with me. And he's a real film and TV geek, and he loved them.
It's really fascinating how much this show has held up over time. People are still discovering it in Rod Serling. And one quote that you had in your book from Rod Serling that I don't think I ever heard before, which was very telling, was, "As long as people talk about you, you're not really dead." And I think it's safe to say, even though he died very early at the age of 50, he is still very much alive and well with us today.
Absolutely. And if he was alive here today, he'd be spinning. He'd be spinning.
At the level of TV today or storytelling, or how do you think he would view
the political situation in the United States would have him just unnerved. And, Rod was one of the first anti-war demonstrators on the Vietnam War. In fact, he was probably the first guy who wrote a teleplay that mentioned the Vietnam War, which is in praise of Pip, which I think was the first episode of the 5th season. And he was very anti-war, especially having seen what he had seen in the Philippines during World War II.
It's very interesting because he wrote all sorts of characters, from children to senior citizens, soldiers, a whole eclectic cast of characters that I think really helped audiences identify with them.
Very true. It's interesting. Again, the joy of an anthology series is that the world is your oyster. He could write in almost anything. I mean, he did feel the pressure, though. I mean, he knew how important it was for him to write, to lead the way, and he was fighting uphill. The Twilight Zone, surprising to me in doing the research, was not a big ratings hit. This is the era of the Untouchables and I Love Lucy and all these westerns and cop shows at that time. I made a point of going through all of the Hollywood Reporters and Daily Varieties from 59 to 64 just to see if the Twilight Zone had been mentioned in ratings. It was rarely mentioned in ratings. So it was not something that Serling could point to James Aubrey and say, stop bickering with me. This is a ratings hit. So not only was it not a ratings hit, but it actually forced him to promote the show as much as possible on his own. And I think part of the motivation, well, he started out just doing the audio introductions first season. But in the second season, he came on camera. And I think that helped. Aubrey kept pointing to the fact that people come to see the same characters each week. That's why these regular narrative series, non-anthology, were working. Alfred Hitchcock had done that well with his show. So Serling was asked to, be the on-camera presence of the show. And that helped a little bit because you're returning to Rod Serling each week, even though he didn't write every episode.
It had some consistency because you had a familiar face there to kind of introduce you to each story and kind of keep it in the same world almost. And like most shows that are ahead of its time, like you mentioned, it wasn't very popular. It might not have been discovered and revered until much later. You mentioned the Alfred Hitchcock Hour. Was that before the Twilight Zone? Were there many anthology shows on the air before the Twilight Zone?
There were some. I want to say Hitchcock was a contemporary and it influenced the Zone. There were a few anthology shows. I remember a show called One Step Beyond, which was a lot of paranormal events. Science fiction, not a lot of science fiction. That's another thing people have to realize. In 59, when Rod went on the air, some people, including Mike Wallace on national television in an interview, thought he was slumming, doing science fiction fantasy. That's not what adults watch. That's more for the kiddies. And, the world was very different in the 50s. The studios were cranking out a lot of science fiction, fantasy, and horror, but mainstream television was a little more highbrow than that. At least when it came to science fiction, fantasy, and horror. They did their westerns, they did their cop shows, they did their game shows, which hardly are highbrow. But right. Science fiction, fantasy, and horror were still kind of considered slumming.
And that reminds me of a quote that you had in the introduction of your Twilight Zone Encyclopedia. You said, "It could be argued that every single motion picture and television show produced in the last 50 years owes a debt to Rod Serling, in an era in which television landscape is dominated by genre series like The Walking Dead and Game of Thrones, and the movie business is all but surrendered to the superpowers of Marvel and DC Comics. That is an enormous debt." So it's safe to say that he's really paved the way for genre television.
Very much so. Very much so. And I think that, like I said earlier, letting your imagination go, never put any limits on your imagination, has inspired some of our greatest filmmakers.
Absolutely. Now, we were just talking about anthologies, and aside from The Zone, are there any other anthology shows that you're a fan of that you would recommend to fans of The Twilight Zone?
Well, a lot of us really love The Outer Limits. And The Outer Limits was an hour series. I believe it only ran 3 seasons, but very high quality. I'm actually surprised that Rod didn't write for. I don't think he wrote for Outer Limits. He might have been elsewhere at the time. I know after The Zone was canceled, Rod went off to teach at Ithaca College. The Outer Limits is a very cool show, very, very sophisticated science fiction show.
What network was The Outer Limits on, by the way?
I'm not sure.
I'm curious if it was on CBS as well, because I figure there would be some sort of crossover right there, being in the same studio and company.
But that's the only one I recommend. I mean, back in the 80s, I remember all of a sudden we had Amazing Stories, which was from Spielberg's, which I thought was certainly an inspired show, but not very good quality, though. In fact, I can only recommend 1 or 2 episodes of its 2-season run. Tales from the Crypt gets high marks. That's another popular show. That was an HBO series.
Now, Tales from the Crypt is based on the old EC comics, which I believe came out in the late 40s, which predates the Twilight Zone.
I believe you're right. I have not done a deep dive on Tales from the Crypt, but my friend Bill Malone directed 2 great episodes, and I've watched those episodes, and they're just terrific. He's a great filmmaker, and I always like to tout him. He did the remake of House on Haunted Hill for Warner Brothers back in 98.
Oh, which episodes of Tales from the Crypt did he do?
Let's see. I know one of his episodes is called The Mask, and a creepier episode you will not find.
Is that with the woman and the man, and she's wearing a mask and she doesn't want her identity? Oh, that was super creepy. No, I loved Tales from the Crypt growing up as well. I mean, obviously, the Twilight Zone kind of primed me for it. Even though it was based on the EC comics, which predates it, definitely were influenced by the Twilight Zone, I feel like. And obviously, a lot of the filmmakers who did it. I believe Richard Donner even directed some episodes of Tales from the Crypt. And as we all know, he directed the episode of the Twilight Zone, one of the most famous ones, Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, which we were just discussing, with the gremlin on the wing of the plane and William Shatner starring.
Very true. Very, very true.
Now, I'm really curious, as you were coming up with this, and I mean, I guess this also pertains to the James Bond Encyclopedia as well, but most specifically the Twilight Zone, what obstacles, both creative and legal, did you run into when writing the encyclopedia?
Creatively, it was a joy. I think part of the joy as a writer in creating an encyclopedia in the computer age is that you can edit as you go. If computers did not exist and you had to write an encyclopedia, you'd probably pull all of your hair out, because every time you wanted to make a change to one entry on page 86 and move it to page 44, you'd have to rewrite the whole encyclopedia, or, you're cutting and pasting. It would be a nightmare. The
Absolutely. Computer
has made the assembly of an encyclopedia a no problem situation. So I love the concept. The concept of encyclopedia started with the James Bond movie Encyclopedia. I had a lot of material left over from my first book, which was called The James Bond Films: A Behind the Scenes History, which was not an encyclopedia. It was literally a history of the Bond films up until the 80s. And I enjoyed that so much that I decided to pitch the Zone Encyclopedia. Now, I love the Mark Zicree book, The Twilight Zone Companion, which for many years was the Bible of the fans. And Mark did amazing research for it. But I thought that what needed to be as a companion book was getting a little bit into the backgrounds of the people involved in the Twilight Zone. So a lot of my book is devoted to over 500 biographies of key performers that people today may not know who they are, but they were critical to the success of the series. People like Jack Klugman and Burgess Meredith and John Anderson, and then newcomers like Robert Redford and Burt Reynolds and James Coburn, those kinds of people who were also involved in the Zone. So I had a lot of it was just pure fun for me, being able to assemble the facts. And then with Zone, I was able to develop a good relationship with Rod Serling's widow, Carol, who recognized what I was doing and supplied me with over 150 photographs, which was very critical. If you're doing a book on a film or TV subject, you need to have good photographs, because people, as wonderful as I think my copy is, people want to see pictures of these people. So Carol started me on the road to getting a great photo collection, and I was able to assemble some good photos.
That's amazing. And I have to commend you. I was going through this book, and the amount of research and level of detail that you put into this thing is I can just imagine how much time it took you to compile all this and write this. If you don't mind, how long did it take in order to put all this together?
2 years.
2 years.
Yeah. I work in Hollywood. I'm a writer and a producer. I'm out there trying to sell shows and films every day. You can go literally decades with no action. And I finally came to the conclusion that being in development is not a productive business to be in solely. So I decided to go back to my book writing because I really felt like I wanted to engage the pop culture marketplace again. And I picked the Zone. And I have to say, it was a lot of fun to be back in print, being able to talk to people about a subject I love. And the success of the Twilight Zone Encyclopedia inspired me to do a new edition of the James Bond movie Encyclopedia as well.
Now, when did the first edition of the Twilight Zone Encyclopedia come out? And what edition are you on currently with the Encyclopedia?
Well, there's only been one edition of the Twilight Zone Encyclopedia.
I see.
So it came out in 2018, and the Bond Encyclopedia came out in 2021.
Now, obviously, you're updating the James Bond Encyclopedia, given that there's new movies being made. Obviously, the Twilight Zone, you're just focusing on the first 5 classic seasons of the show. So there's really nothing else to add to it. Do you anticipate any more editions of the book coming out, or is this the definitive edition?
I think, other than if I'm asked by the publisher to pencil in some additional information, when people die, and, I do have their birth and death dates, I will update that way. But I like the fact that I could do the Zone and not have to worry about it again, because I just wanted to focus on those first 5 seasons. I have not embraced the color episodes at all. I watched 2 episodes of the Jordan Peele revival recently, and I just did not come away with a great motivation, even though I obviously respected that they were doing it.
So speaking of the newest revival of the series by Jordan Peele, you said you watched a couple of the episodes and it just didn't really stack up to you. I'm curious, which episodes did you watch? Was it the first and second one, or was it kind of...
I watched the first episode about the stand-up comic, which I thought was okay. Mm-hmm. I enjoyed that. But the second episode, which was kind of a Nightmare at 20,000 feet kind of redo involving an iPad, I thought was so awful. I wanted to throw my boot at the TV. I thought it was just terrible. And I hate to say bad things about anything, but that episode really sucked.
That's very funny. Those are the exact 2 episodes that I watched of the newest series too, and I never returned to it just because I guess I wasn't that enamored by the new ones in order to continue with it. The Nightmare at, I think it was called 30,000 feet was what they updated it to for that second episode. I thought it was interesting that they tried something new. As soon as I saw the name of the episode, I was like, oh God, they're doing another remake of this. We already had one in the movie, but I thought it was pretty decent. But obviously, it only lasted for 2 seasons. They're not continuing with any more. It's another failed revival of the show. I know you haven't seen a whole lot of episodes of all of them, but for your money, which is the best revival, or would you say none of them really classify that? Obviously, we have the 1985 version that came out. We have the 2002 version, which came out on UPN, and then the latest iteration.
You're talking to somebody who has virtually not watched anything. For me to go 2 episodes into Peele was a big deal. I didn't watch any of the 85 revivals, and I didn't watch any of the 2002 revivals. I'm sounding like a real snob now, but for me, it was Serling, Matheson, Beaumont, Johnson. That's it for me. There Absolutely. Are some other writers, of course, too, but I just thought the originals are what I just groove on.
Now, obviously, 1985, that iteration didn't have a host. 2002 brought in Forrest Whitaker as a host, and then we had Jordan Peele as a host in the latest iteration. One of the reasons why I feel that these latest iterations didn't work is that in the original, we had Rod Serling, who was obviously the showrunner and the writer of a lot of the episodes, introducing them. He really had a deep connection to them, and I think him being the narrator really helped bring the audience in and cultivate that magic, which I really think was missing in a lot of the later iterations of it.
I think you're right. I also think it's very tough to get ratings for an anthology show. This was James Aubrey's gripe way back in the late 1950s and early 60s. People like to go back to familiar characters. So I actually worked at Showtime in the 90s, and we had two series. One was a kind of a film noir revival series called Fallen Angels, also anthology, with some wonderful stories by Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler, those kinds of things. And then we had another show that was a little bit more popcorn. It was a revival of the 1950s American International babes and motorcycle pictures. We called it Rebel Highway. And both of those shows were very inspired. They were a lot of fun. But none of them really attracted a lot of attention because, again, it was anthology. It was a new story each week.
And it's hard to keep audiences engaged when it's a new story and it's not returning characters. But again, for us that are fans of The Zone, part of the appeal of the show is the fact that it's a new story and it's new characters every week that we get to grow to learn and follow their journey and get that nice twist at the end that we all look forward to.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Now, you mentioned that you worked at Showtime. I heard that you also did PR work as a feature unit publicist. And correct me if I'm wrong, you were assigned to films such as one of my favorites, Porky's 2, Pretty in Pink, Weekend at Bernie's 2. Can you tell us a little briefly what it was like working as a feature unit publicist? Were you on set to these films at all? And what did the work entail?
Well, first of all, I discovered early on in my post-college career that being a freelance writer was not going to pay the bills. So I fell into public relations work. I came back from a trip to Europe one year, and a friend said I should leave my resumes at PR agencies because they like writers. Writers do biographies, they do press releases, they do presentations. Your writing skill could be useful. I had also published 2 articles in the LA Times, one on whatever happened to all the James Bond girls, which got a lot of attention. And then I did a story on whatever happened to the children from The Sound of Music. Both articles got me a lot of attention. The PR agency that hired me actually was impressed that I had gotten a major story in the LA Times calendar section. So I ended up going to work in a PR agency. I knew nothing about PR. I got a quick education on how important it is to the film and television business. And interestingly, my boss gave me a lot of non-entertainment clients. So at first I was a little uninspired, but I did a good job. And then this lady kept on coming into the office showing some still photographs from one of the movies she's been working on. She was trying to get approvals so that she could give them to the studio. And I asked her one day, what did she do? And she said, I'm a unit publicist. And that was like a lightning strike moment. I said, oh my God, I think I found what I want to be doing. And she ended up leaving the ranks of unit work and became head of publicity for MGM, hired me to be a unit publicist on my first movie.
And what was the first movie that you were a unit publicist on?
Was sent up to Wyoming in the fall of 1981 to be the unit publicist on an Alan Rudolph thriller called Endangered Species with Robert Urich and Jo Beth Williams and Hoyt Axton and Paul Dooley. It was a cool concept. It was basically about these cattle mutilations on the plains, almost something from a Twilight Zone episode. So a local sheriff teams up with a police detective who's vacationing to figure out what's killing these cows. And that's the story of Endangered Species. It's a good takeoff. And then I ended up doing Porky's 2, as you mentioned. I did Pretty in Pink for John Hughes. I did Weekend at Bernie's 2 for Victor Dre. I did Eddie and the Cruisers 2. I would always be assigned the lousy sequel to a good movie.
They gave you all the sequels. You're the sequel guy.
I mean, I went down to Mexico for 3 months. I worked on a movie called The Taking of Beverly Hills, which was kind of a diehard ripoff with Ken Wall, where Peter Lamont, who later won an Oscar for designing Titanic, rebuilt Rodeo Drive in Beverly Hills in one of the poorest neighborhoods in Mexico on a soccer field. It's one of the largest sets you've ever seen in your life. They literally built 2/3 of very Tony Rodeo Drive with concrete and buildings. It was just extraordinary because there was going to be a big shootout in this movie. I had a wonderful time on all these things. And then in 92, I went to Showtime to kind of supervise their production publicity units. I did some units, and then I was hiring the unit publicist, and I spent 10 years there. That's where I made my producing debut in 2002 on a baseball comedy called Bleacher Bums.
Oh, so you were at Showtime and you did Bleacher Bums. Were there any other projects that you worked on while you were working there that you could tell us about?
Well, I developed a biography of Rod Serling.
Get out of here.
In fact, that's when I first met Carol Serling. Two writers named Paul Clemens and Ron McGid, who are fine writers, came to me with the idea of doing a 2-hour original movie on the life of Rod Serling. And we got the rights from Carol. We developed the screenplay, and then both of our executives left the company, and the project just fell flat, unfortunately.
I feel like that would be an awesome movie idea, writing about the life of Rod Serling, and also giving them his roses. I mean, people need to know a little bit more about how much he contributed to pop culture and storytellers, and I feel like having a biography of the man really do him justice.
It would definitely. And there may still be a project. It won't be the Clemens McGid project, but a friend of mine, Andrew Myron, who's a prominent real estate developer in Southern California and a very good writer, has written that biography film. But I don't think anything's happening with it at the moment. But you're absolutely right. It could be a great show.
Well, fingers crossed that someday people come to their senses and they make one, because the man deserves it. You mentioned when you were doing research for this book, you had access to Rod Serling's wife, who gave you a lot of photographs and a lot of information about him. Is there anything that you can share with us, either about Rod Serling's personal life or about his creative process, that you learn with conversations with her?
I asked that question of Carol one day: what motivated Rod in his stories? Where did he get his inspiration from? Who were the things, or what were the things that really compelled him to write? So she handed me this book, which was a bound copy. It was, they published his live television dramas from the 1950s when he was writing for live television shows like Patterns, Requiem for a Heavyweight, The Comedian, and they had been published. So she gave me his personal copy, which contained a very strong preface talking about what motivated him as a writer. And I couldn't wait to dive into that. So I brought it home. I left it on my desk. I think my wife and I had to go out for dinner. I came back and the book disappeared.
And it hasn't turned up to this day?
I looked for that book for 3 days, and it literally was sitting on it. Nobody broke into our house. There's no sign. First of all, I don't know if they just break in to steal a book that really wasn't that valuable. It wasn't signed by Rod Serling, thank God. I ended up repurchasing it. I got a copy off of the internet for $100, but to this day, I don't know what happened that book. We're remodeling my house, so they actually tore my office apart. So it wasn't in any hidden walls or anything like that. But I have a feeling that there is there is a dimensional doorway in my house. That's where that book will be found.
So kind of like in the episode Little Girl Lost, it just kind of tumbled away into another dimension.
Exactly.
You mentioned that you were able to find the preface again later on. Is there anywhere where listeners can find this preface at in order to learn a little bit more about his process?
Well, just look up online the collection of Rod Serling's live television dramas. It's a published book, and that will have the preface that he talks about that. Absolutely.
Cool. Well, I'll be looking forward to checking that out. Now, we've come to the end of our podcast here, and I have some special questions that I want to ask you here, Steve. You can consider these curveball or pop quiz questions. I thought long and hard about these. Many of them I don't even know the answers to. Let me ask you this. Are you ready?
I am ready.
Drum roll, please. First question. What actor or actress starred in the most Twilight Zone episodes?
Oh, okay. That's not difficult. Jack Klugman and Burgess Meredith and John Anderson, I believe, all starred in 4 episodes.
3-way tie.
Yeah, there was like a three-way tie, exactly.
I was going to say Burgess Meredith. That would have been my guess, but interesting that they all had the same amount of episodes that they did. Nice. For your money, what is the best season of The Twilight Zone?
I would say the first season. I think that it's extraordinarily high up there in terms of quality. Some of the best episodes, Walking Distance, Stop at Willoughby, Where Is Everybody, which is the debut episode. It's stacked very much in the first season, but second, third, and fifth seasons, the half hours, there's always great episodes. And like I said earlier, the fourth season hours are very underrated.
I would agree. Season 1, that would have been my answer. Also, 16 Millimeter Shrine is one that they have in the first season. That's definitely one of my favorite episodes. If I were to pick a follow-up best season, it would definitely be season 5, of following up season 1. But obviously, you can find amazing episodes in each and every season of The Zone. Next question. Which opening title sequence do you like best?
It's a very good question. Even though it doesn't feature the signature theme, it's just Bernard Herrmann's mood music. First season is I think, very moody. When they introduced the Twilight Zone theme in the second season, I think that was terrific. And there were adjustments made to the narrative, but I'd say 1 and 2 are my favorite.
Okay, that's fair. I would agree with that. Now, this next question right here, this might be considered a little left field, so just be prepared. Imagine a world where Rod Serling wrote a James Bond movie. How would it turn out, good or bad?
By the way, Siri just came on when you asked me that question for no reason.
Hey, that means something. Rod's in the building.
Rod's in the building. It wouldn't work at all. I think Rod was a very talky writer, and I don't think he would have been comfortable in the visualization that's needed to do a James Bond movie. Certainly the dialogue moments would be good, but people don't go to watch a James Bond movie for the dialogue moments. Even though, for my money, the best dialogue is in the early Richard Maybaum episodes, like From Russia with Love and Goldfinger.
I would agree with that. It's more about the spectacle, the chase sequences, the bombs, the girls. Definitely a much different aesthetic than Rod's sort of writing and style. Last question right here for you. This is, what was the highest rated episode?
You know, I have it in my book, I think. I'm trying to remember now. It's not coming to me. I'll have to defer to you on that. It's in my book under ratings, I believe.
Fair enough. I'm glad I found one that stumped you.
You definitely stumped me. I wanted to say the third season starter, which was the Bob Cummings episode, Flight Whatever Does Not Return. I forget the name of it.
I think that's all the time we have for today. I'd like to thank our guest, Steve Rubin, for being on the show today and sharing with us his breadth of knowledge and love of The Zone. Steve, tell our guests where they can find you at and learn more about you and all your upcoming projects.
Sure. Well, I have a website. It's StephenJRubin.com. It's Jay and then Rubin. I do a podcast every week on Amazon, Apple, and Spotify. It's called Steve Rubin's Saturday Night at the Movies, where I get to interview a lot of the people about their film experiences. I've had some fun times with that and continuing to have fun. In fact, we interviewed Jo Beth Williams the other day about the 40th anniversary of Poltergeist, which certainly was a show inspired by the Twilight Zone.
Oh, absolutely. And Steven Spielberg, the producer of that, obviously, who did one of the episodes of the Twilight Zone movie.
Right. And Jo Beth and I have known each other for years because, like I said, I worked with her on that first film, Endangered Species. And then I worked with her later on a film called Desert Bloom, about a family living in Nevada prior to the first nuclear test, which is a very terrific drama that Columbia kind of dumped. I should have been given a better fate. John Voight's in it, Ellen Barkin. So yes, the podcast is great. I'm on Facebook. Just look up Steve Rubin. I'm holding my mother-in-law's Maltese in my hands. There's about 37 Steve Rubins. I'm the only one holding a Maltese. That's Kimmy. And
look for the one with the Maltese, folks.
And then I have a page called Steve. So what do I call it? I call it Classic Film Lollapalooza.
Ooh.
And that gives me an opportunity to talk about my podcasts and classic films.
And where can we find your podcast at, Steve?
Steve Rubin's Saturday Night the Movies is on the Apple, Amazon, and Spotify platforms.
Check it out, folks. Got a lot of good stuff in it. Steve, I really want to thank you for being on our show today. I really want to thank you for sharing your encyclopedia with us. It's been a pleasure to dive back into the zone, learn all these extra facts about it, and have this discussion with you today. So thank you so much for being on.
It's been an absolute pleasure. You've done terrific homework. I appreciate you being so prepared, and be safe out there.
I came with specific quotes. I thought of all these curveball questions. I really wanted to bring my A game today, so I'm happy to hear that you had a good time on the podcast as well. I've been your host, JP. Don't forget to check out the other episodes of our podcast and click that like and subscribe button to show your support. As always, stay cheesy, and remember, there's nothing to fear but film itself. I'll see you guys next time here on Cinephobia.